All right. So today I am joined by Greg Dember, one of the, well, I would say a voice very paramount in the metamodernism conversation. I've been following your stuff for a while. You have a writing partner, Linda Cirillo. Am I saying her name correctly? I believe so.
Ariello. Yeah.
Cirillo. Thanks. And so you guys have written together on metamodernism. But I thought what would be really interesting for this conversation is to explore, I guess, metamodernisms, as silly as that might sound. But yeah, the different usages of the term, genealogies, and divergences, things like that. So the use of the term metamodernism, I don't want to quite say it's contested, but there's certainly different camps, different sort of groups that are using it in slightly different ways, and I think that different people kind of have, I don't even want to say different claims to it, but different investments in the term and in different ways. And so some of the things that have come up in conversations about metamodernism, whether it's on Facebook or elsewhere, is sort of, a presentation of a certain idea, and then it's like, well, I don't know if that's quite the metamodernism that I'm talking about, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to kind of delve into that pretty directly and see if we could come up with, I don't know, at least kind of map that terrain a little bit, and then maybe see if there could be any kind of consensus, or at least mapping the divergences and things like that. So to kind of tee you up, I guess I'd be curious to hear your understanding of the term metamodernism and metamodern, and maybe some of the kind of biographical history in terms of your coming to that term and the ideas behind it and all that. And then we can kind of go from there.
Okay, I'll take a shot at that. For me, I think metamodernism is like to understand metamodernism, or to give a meaning to the term, you start by looking at a collection of cultural artifacts that exist. So, and for me, that's how I came to it. Like, I had already started noticing trends in a kind of feeling and vibe in the culture that was changing, and that was exemplified by different movies and songs and fiction, and television shows, and the kind of humor that stand-up comedians were moving into and all that. And so, like, that collection of cultural products, to me, is a thing, regardless of what we name it, and having come of age during the period when everybody said everything was postmodern, like that was kind of the word to describe the current cultural vibe when I was coming of age. I very much, as I started noticing this stuff, it felt different from the postmodern stuff. And, I became curious, like, well, what will people call this? And, obviously, like, postmodern would be the first term that would come to mind, but that's kind of clunky. I think now postmodern, as an aside, I think postmodernism or postmodern ends up being a good kind of umbrella generic term for all of the possible postmodernisms, metamodernism being one of them. But as just kind of like the name of the thing, it's awkward. So it's like, well, what's it going to be called? And Linda was the one who found the work of Vermeulen and Van Denneker online, and their essay, their 2010 essay, Notes on Metamodernism. And, she and I had been talking about these cultural trends a lot. And when she saw that article, she was like, hey, I think some people are talking about the same thing we've been talking about, and here's their word for it, metamodernism. And, it all kind of made sense to me. And they had examples of what they were talking about, and it sounded, you know, a lot of them were the same examples I would give, and others were some other ones, you know. And that, you know, I mean, should you know what I'm talking about, but should we get more specific?
Yeah. Well, no, yeah. I
should?
don't think we necessarily have to spell it out, because probably people tuning into this conversation have some, you know, context for it. And
Okay.
and so, yeah, sorry. So here's how I would think about it. Is like, I was also introduced to the term through the writing of Vermeulen and Vandenacker. That's how I say their names, being a Yankee. So for me, metamodernism was that. It was basically what they were talking about, or at least, you know, they were kind of setting it up. They were proposing a framework for talking about these things, and which, you know, I think galvanized a lot of people, or at least that a lot of people found that to be very useful and helpful to kind of, this is what we've been talking about or thinking about, or, you know, in your case, intuiting sort of for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that in the history of the term and the idea, what we mean by metamodernism, I think, definitely begins with them. It begins with Vermeulen and Vandenacker, and then Alison Gibbons, and so I guess what then the question becomes is, after that happens, and they published that article in 2010, then you start finding that being picked up and sort of used in different ways by different people.
Well, I mean, I think we should, now that we're getting into this part of the conversation, we probably should say what Vermeulen and Vandenacker's.
Sure. Yeah. Take it away. Yeah. Give a little synopsis.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have their famous quote memorized, so it'll be my own twist on it. But they basically talk about a sensibility that oscillates between modernist and postmodern sensibilities in various kind of oppositional pairs. So a sensibility that oscillates between earnestness and irony. That's the one most people have heard of. You know, between unity and fragmentation, between universalism and specificity, between enthusiasm and skepticism,
or even just modernism and postmodernism, really. I mean, or maybe not. I don't know if you would. I mean, I think that one of the ways of thinking about metamodernism, as they articulate it, is almost a sort of Hegelian synthesis of, you know, modernism and postmodernism. They don't use those terms, so they're not.
Well, really I think actually, if you don't mind, I'll correct you on that. I think they go out of their way to say they don't mean a synthesis.
True.
They mean an oscillation.
Right, the continual back and forth. No, that's true. So that's a good point. Yeah, but I mean, in terms of the polarities there that are being oscillated between, they are a kind of distinctly modern or modernist sensibility and a distinctly postmodern sensibility. Yeah,
and one thing that I came to recently when I was having a conversation with somebody about all this is that I think in its most intense form, that oscillation is in the experience of the audience to the object. So there's a creative object, and the viewer or listener or reader oscillates in experiencing that object as sincere or ironic, as hopeful or skeptical. It's not just like the object has a postmodern part and another modern part mushed up together. It's that the object itself engenders this oscillation in the kind of creative reception of it by the audience. Does that make sense?
Well, sure. Yeah, I'm muting myself here and there. There is some planes going by here the other minute. Right. And I think maybe to kind of frame all of this in an important way is that this is a cultural theory. This is a descriptive cultural theory that is sort of attempting to account for cultural artifacts in explaining them. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go on, and if you have more to kind of.
That's all I had to say on that that part about oscillation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So so Vermeulen and Vandenacker talk about this oscillation between typically modern and postmodern sensibilities, and it's a kind of unique structure of feeling in its own right that does that, and that's this metamodernism that they're talking about.
Right.
And then, of course, then you can look at a bunch of different things that have been created in the past, I don't know, 20 years, let's just say, and say that has that element to it. That's a very metamodern kind of cultural product. Now, so that's that, and that's how I heard of it, and that's how I think in its current phase is, different people have sort of tried to attempt the genealogy approach and say, well, who was the first person to use the term and all that, and there's certainly value to that in kind of an archaeological sense, but I think that where this really gets started is with their 2010 article in the journal, Journal of Aesthetics and Culture.
I mean, you could certainly say that when they began using it in their way, a whole discourse opened up and it took off, whereas the people who had used it before were fairly isolated and didn't really engender kind of an ongoing.
And probably, meant slightly different things by the term. I mean, ultimately, So leaving that sort of aside and moving on from there.
Sure.
So then this term is sort of in the discourse. It's in it's sort of out in the world. It touches a nerve. People find it useful, and sort of some flashpoints along that line. You get Luke Turner has a Metamodernist manifesto, I think the year after that initial article is published. And then, of course, Turner and was it Turner, Ronco, and LeBoeuf? Yeah, they all kind of do this art thing nominally,
performance conceptual art.
Yeah, which they conceive of as being metamodernist and all this. And Seth Abramson is another early voice who seems to have sort of trailed off. I haven't really seen him much engaging in the.
Yeah, I mean, he's shifted his focus to politics.
Sure. So you have some of those early voices, and then the Hanzi books come out. So I think the first Hanzi book, The Listening Society, was published in 2017. I'm skipping over Brent Cooper too, who also he put out a video and then started his abstract organization and whatnot. And without kind of getting into every single specific person who might have found the term and was doing. I mean, I myself was I started a thing called Metamodern Classicism at some point in like 2013 or, and so, but, obviously those things didn't really pan out so much. And, but in any event,
2013 was around when Linda and I started our website.
Okay. Yeah. Right. And then you've got your stuff. And then, so all that stuff sort of percolating in different sort of areas. But the Hanzi books come out in 2017, and Hanzi Freinacht, in his Metamodern Guide to Politics series, which is a sort of will, I guess, presumably be 6 or 7 books. But the first book,
Freinacht, of course, being a fictional character,
right? A pseudonymous figure who is 2 different individuals writing under that name. Who they put out this book in 2017 and very explicitly say that they're making use of metamodernism as used by Tim Vermeulen and Robin Vandenacker et al. And but as a philosophical engine, and that this is sort of the framework that they're using, but then also adding something to it. And without getting into kind of all of that, I feel like then there's sort of this is where maybe a kind of bifurcation in some ways sort of begins or occurs, where so I would say, to kind of jump forward a little bit, without hopefully confusing too much, I would say to jump forward, there are, it seems to me, sort of these two current sort of dynamics, that one kind of is sort of traces its kind of, I don't know, its lineage or something, just purely back to this sort of Vermeulen-Vandenacker source. And then the other is sort of this Hanzian metamodernism. And they seem to be sort of slightly overlapping in a sort of Venn diagram way, but also not quite the same thing. I guess maybe I have to kind of get in a little bit to the Hanzi stuff to kind of explain why that's the case and what that means. But it seems to me that the biggest thing that happens is that the Hanzi books use metamodernism, but sort of adapt and extend it in its kind of meaning. So no longer is it for them just this sort of cultural, descriptive, here's what's going on. It's a new structure of feeling akin to postmodernism, and we can see it in all these cultural artifacts. Instead, it's sort of, it becomes a philosophy, a way of looking at the world that kind of people can learn and implement. And it becomes a developmental stage, which is sort of like, well, there was modernism, and then that developed to postmodernism, and then that developed into metamodernism.
Right, and they see that as a cognitive developmental stage for individual humans, and also a social developmental stage for society.
Right, right. So then there's this, it's a different thing. So maybe just pausing there for a second to kind of take stock of all that. How, and here's a big question, I guess, and in some ways sort of gets at kind of the heart of all this. I mean, how do you interpret that sort of Hanzian metamodernism and the community that's sort of arisen around it? And the last thing I'll just say about that before I'll throw it over to you is this also has sort of overlapped with a bunch of other territories that sort of in the Venn diagram of like, here's Hanzi and here's, you know, the original metamodernism, and it's like, here's Hanzi and here's integral theory, and here's, you know, and so actually just so Brent Cooper wrote an interesting article. It's called Integral Metamodernism and the IDW, and there's two parts. And he says pretty explicitly at some point that, you know, metamodernism and integral theory don't really have much to do with each other, and he kind of lays out a lot of those things in there. But clearly, and at least in terms of its early formulations, right? But this is sort of what we're getting at, is that with this Hanzian development stuff, it's bringing in a lot of these other communities into the conversation, and sort of reframing what metamodernism is for a lot of people. And I think that the original kind of conception of it is sort of not quite as paramount in these conversations. So yeah, throwing it over to you. I mean, what do you make of that? And what's your interpretation of that sort of movement?
Yeah, I'm guessing that if I was drawing a Venn diagram, I would have even less of an overlap between them than you might. So I mean, just, I guess I would say, you know, I mean, people often say, you know, the Vermeulen-Vandenacker metamodernism is descriptive, and the Hanzian metamodernism is a prescriptive philosophy. But I kind of take issue even with that way of comparing them, because I don't think that the thing that Vermeulen and Vandenacker describe is the same thing as that which the Hanzi authors prescribe.
So can you parse that a little bit? Why do you feel that, and how do you feel that they're different?
Okay, well, what, you know, as we already said, what Vermeulen and Vandenacker are describing, and one could prescribe more of this too. It's not that they can't be prescriptive. What they're describing is this sensibility and aesthetic of vibe that has this oscillating between modernist and postmodern qualities. And what the Hanzi authors are prescribing is that developmental stage theory should be taken into account kind of throughout society, in government and other institutions, that the world would be better if, instead of government only focusing on kind of material needs, if it focused on the psychological development and cognitive advancement of people. And, and I think not just governments, but other institutions as well. But I think that's why they're calling it political, because they think that the thing that metamodernism is to them, they think that their political cause is that be included in policy making.
Yeah.
But the thing that metamodernism is to them is an interest in cognitive development. And that's not the same thing as.
Well, now, all right. So now we're getting into the meat of it, right? Because and it sounds like.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure, of course.
The other thing too is that you brought up integral theory, Ken Wilber's integral, and I think that the content of the Hanzi work is very similar to Ken Wilber's integral theory, and it's not exactly the same, but to me it's more like they're taking integral theory and modifying it by freeing it from some of its spiritual presumptions, in order to maybe make it appealing to a wider audience, and then adding this kind of advocacy part, like it shouldn't just be something that people ponder, it should be put into society. And so the real question is, how much do metamodernism, as in Vermeulen and Van Denneker, how much does that overlap with integral theory?
Right.
And I don't think it overlaps very much with integral theory. And so therefore, I don't think Hanzian metamodernism overlaps very much with Vermeulen and Van Denneker's metamodernism.
So, right. And I think even Brent Cooper in his article says as much, that sort of, the metamodernism of Vermeulen and Van Denneker is here and integral is here. But the way I see it is more that like the Hanzian stuff is what is the bridge. Because the way that I see it is that I do see a very fundamental connection between what the Hanzi writers are doing and the original sort of exposition of metamodernism by Vermeulen and Van Denneker in many different ways. I mean, at one level, well, here's something too, is that so here's metamodernism and here's integral, right? And my supposition would be that Hanzi is sort of the bridge. I do think that even with integral, so like I'm in the process of finishing this at the moment, which is integral spirituality. And what it basically is an attempt to re-articulate spirituality in a post-metaphysical way, in a way that moves beyond the limitations of both modernism and postmodernism as mindsets for spiritual thinking. And I mean, I think the whole kind of, Wilber corpus is sort of about that kind of change, the shift in development through these different, I don't know what you want to call them, stages, I guess would be what he calls them, but in the sense that they're also cultural periods, so that traditionalism and then modernism and postmodernism. And so what I see as being a unifying element to all of these is the recognition that there is this thing called modernism that had a certain kind of, structure, feeling, or sensibility or mindset. There is this thing called postmodernism that sort of reacted against that, responded to it, exposed some of its failures. And then there's this attempt to but then also had its own failures and its own mindset. Right. And then there's this attempt to kind of get beyond both of them, or all of them, and to sort of integrate or to combine or to, so like obviously integral would be it's integrating the best of all these, but with Vermeulen Bondenacker, it's oscillating back and forth between them. But there's some element, and this is why I brought up Hegel earlier, there's some element of this sort of, yes, it's not a true synthesis in the Hegelian sense, but it is an element of taking elements from both and coming up with something new that's neither of its previous instantiations, but it is sort of, it arises from them and responds to them, and it attempts to correct for both of their weaknesses. So in that sense, I feel like Integral is doing something similar to what metamodernism, as a cultural period is about, and also what Hanzi is about in their books. And so if that very broadly could be conceived of as a certain kind of project of trying to, and you mentioned earlier this broad umbrella idea of postmodernism, they all seem to be forms of postmodernism. Would you agree with that, or would you take it? Yeah.
Well, I actually, I can more easily say that the Hanzi project is a form or a suggestion for a postmodern direction. And my only reservation on saying Wilbur's Integral is postmodern is just that he started doing that a long time ago, right in the heart of the postmodern period. So, you might say that he was ahead of his time, or that it was post modern.
Well, yeah. So
it's just a little complicated in that way.
Right. He refers to it as a sort of proto-metamodern thing.
Proto-postmodern.
Sure.
Or proto-postmodern.
Yeah. Okay. Or if, to the degree that one sees metamodernism as being increasingly the category that sort of subsumes all the various postmodernisms, and maybe that's something worth kind of getting into, is maybe it's not, maybe you wouldn't see that, because obviously people have attempted to articulate different ideas of what's after postmodernism, digimodernism, and a lot of my series, the YouTube series, is about remodernism, performatism. So at the same time, though, it seems like, the way I think of it anyway, is that metamodernism is sort of a catch-all in some way that I think you can see in the various forms of postmodernism that have been developing similar ideas, similar threads that kind of, there's a continuity there. And so even though these might have been originally called different things, I feel like metamodernism is a useful term to sort of encapsulate them all. Would you have an issue with that?
Yeah, I can go with that. I can see that being the direction that it's going in. So, and I think, like historically, if you look at the writing when metamodernism was a new term, and digimodernism had just preceded it a little bit, and altermodernism had also just preceded it. So like originally, there was an issue, I forget what it was an issue of, but there was a special issue of some academic publication dedicated to postmodernism, and they juxtaposed these various options: metamodernism, digimodernism, altermodernism. They might have talked about performatism, and if they didn't, they should have. And then what I can see is that and so the differences between them were kind of held forth. And I can see that ultimately, metamodernism might be the term that sort of wins out in terms of being widely adopted, and then it ends up going further than what Vermeulen and Van Denneker originally envisioned. So, and like Abramson's metamodernism, to me, really is more like digimodernism, actually. But he also brings in some of the Vermeulen and Van Denneker stuff too. And we do live in a digital world. That's a huge part. So the ultimate theory of what the prevalent structure of feeling is for, the early part of the 21st century might end up including more than what Vermeulen and Van Denneker suggested,
Mm-hmm.
and some of these other things would be part of it. And then you just like, I don't think, like, you and I or anybody gets to decide how this is going to go. It's just going to go how it goes.
Right. Well, right. So that's a big thing too, right? Which is that, once these things are out there, in the sense too that, like, with, I don't know, the way that once a work is out in the world, the author kind of loses control of it in a certain sense. Similarly, as a cultural theorist, you put a theory out into the world, and now people can use that, adopt it, adapt it, evolve it, mutate it, and and so, right. So I guess I find it to be personally of more use and utility if this sort of term is broadly conceived, in the sense that if people, because it seems very clear to me anyway, maybe you disagree, that the Hanzi folks understand what Vermeulen and Vandenacker are talking about.
Oh, yes, yeah, I'm not sure they do.
Interesting. Okay, because for me, I think that they're just, intelligence and whatnot aside, which I think is very high, and I think they're very capable thinkers. I think that they seem to express a recognition of the basic idea and the tenets. They're just, it seems like, pushing it in a different or a new direction. They're applying it in ways that, right, I don't think that Vermeulen and Vandenacker foresaw, or were even necessarily was within their ken of trying to articulate. But once the ideas are out there, I feel like if they're adopting this term as being, and also, there's a whole appendix in the first book that kind of gets pretty in depth about the Vermeulen Vandenacker work.
Yeah, but what they say in that appendix is they say, we're Shanghaiing your term.
Yeah, I guess it's a question, right, of how seriously to take that.
They don't name Vermeulen and Van Denneker, but they say to you academics who coined the term, or it's Hanzi, so it's the first person. I was gonna talk in the plural, but it's in the first person singular. So Hanzi says, I think you are cowards. It's not friendly. And it's not even humorous. Maybe they would say we're just being funny, but it's not friendly. It's like throwing down the gauntlet.
It's interesting. So yeah, I really would love to get Tim Vermeulen. I've had some conversations with him about maybe trying to get him on, which would be great, because which is another, it's an aside, but it's an interesting one, which is that I feel like after the publication of their book, Metamodernism, I forget the exact subtitle, Depth, Historicity, and Affect. Yeah. After Postmodernism, something.
And now you're talking about Vermeulen, Van Denneker, and Gibbons' book.
Right, exactly. After that publication of their book, I feel like they haven't been particularly active in the metamodernism conversation.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I'm actually kind of curious about why that's the case. I would, again, I'd love to kind of talk to them directly and kind of get their sense directly about what they.
But other scholars have continued, and I don't mean the Hanzi people. I mean other scholars in actual academic, departments in various fields have used Vermeulen and Van Denneker's metamodernism in their work, and are communicating and collaborating with each other. So like I don't feel that Tim and Robin gave over the discourse to Hanzi,
right?
Abdicated it to Hanzi. I feel that to whatever extent they've given it over to anybody, they've given it over to other academics.
I agree. Yeah.
To use it in the same
way.
Way.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think I would venture even to suppose that part of the reason they're not wading too much into the conversation is because I would sense they're aware of the idea that after they put something into the world, they're not really in control of it. And I think that as soon as you try to control a particular theory, and say, even,
Well, I
because
mean,
yeah,
in the introduction to that book that you've named, and in a 2015 essay called Misunderstandings and Clarifications, while graciously saying like, sure, we don't own this word and it's not up to us to police its use, they say, just to be clear, we don't mean this, we don't mean this, we don't
mhm,
mean that, and we don't
yeah,
mean the other thing. So they've taken a stand and
yeah.
made,
And I mean, there's so many different ways, that this could kind of branch off into different elements. And I almost feel like I really need to wait until I would have some more explicit discussion with some of those guys, because all I can do is
yeah,
sort of conjecture, and I don't want
yeah,
to necessarily do that too much. But to get back to the sort of the Hanzi versus so yeah, Brent Cooper uses that idea of the Dutch school and the Nordic school, which I also take some issue with. I feel like it's it doesn't quite. Well, maybe the issue is just that I really do feel like Hanzi is continuing the tradition of what
yeah.
Robin and Tim put
Well,
out, and taking in
and
a
so
new.
here's where we're differing. So maybe we should
Yeah,
address that.
sure. So, all right. So let me give some examples, and let me
Okay.
let me know if you disagree with these. But so one of the elements of this, I would say, of what I wish I had a shorthand to refer to. Let's just say notes. I don't know. How do we refer shorthand to Tim and Robin's?
We can say V and V. Is
All
that
right,
okay?
V and V, sure. So
Yeah.
V and V's version is, recognizing that there's this oscillation between the modern and the postmodern sensibilities. There's the return in a qualified sense of sincerity
Affect,
and affect, and
depth.
also, yeah, depth. Sure, all those things, and to, elements of myth and I don't know if they specifically speak to this, but the idea of grand narrative thinking is at least sort of in the background. Maybe I'm bringing too much of my own work to superimposing it on them. But the idea of, if you think of
Well,
postmodern,
let me just interject here.
yeah,
I hope we have a chance to talk about, your work and your metamodernism, and not only about the Hanzi
sure,
metamodern. At
yeah, I
some
guess.
point.
Yeah, at some point for sure. I hope, I plan for this to be a ongoing series, and
Okay.
so yeah, many more conversations to go. This immediate conversation was spawned because I guess, well, actually, for my own part, I've been really actually delving into the Hanzi books in earnest over the past, I don't know how long exactly, and which is in contrast to sort of just knowing about them, but being like,
Okay.
well, I don't know. And since I've become more familiar and actually read the works, it's been like kind of opening a door or a window into something new and exciting and interesting, and I do find it of value. And so because of that, I think it's sort of shifted how I am conceiving the term metamodernism, or at the very least, it's made me less sort of parochial in my sense of like, well, that's just a knockoff or derivative or something. I feel
Mhm.
like there really is a genuine and authentic engagement with the original material there,
Hmm.
however much
I
it is.
do differ pretty strongly on that.
What's that? You disagree with that very strongly? Is
Yeah.
that what you said? Yeah, and so because of that, I'm finding myself in the position of like, being kind of in the with a foot in both worlds in a sense, and
Mhm.
and sensing that dichotomy between the sort of V and V school or paradigm and the sort of Hanzi community, and feeling like, well, and to be perfectly honest, feeling like it would be great if this wasn't so much of a strong division, But wouldn't it be great, or isn't it at least an interesting idea to pursue, of maybe seeing how potentially there could be a broader umbrella that could kind of encapsulate all of these things in a way that isn't sort of like, well, you know, because my concern would be the sort of purity test thing of sort of like,
Sure.
well, you know, that's not really it. And then it's like, well, but what do we really get from doing that? And can't we acknowledge maybe that there are similarities, overlaps, you know, congruities, while there are also divergences and different and evolutions and things of that nature. So, but to get back to my sort of analysis would be that the Hanzi books are sort of an enactment, I feel like, of what V&V are talking about, which is
That's interesting that you think that.
well, so what I mean by that is considering that postmodernism sort of puts the kibosh on any kind of grand narrative thinking or any kind of notion of really value hierarchy or anything like that. And whereas, you know, quite in contrast to modernism, which was sort of had its own narrative of progress and development and all that, those are sort of the two paradigms. Those are the poles. And metamodernism, as put forward by V&V, they say, well, this new thing called metamodernism is sort of, it brings back some of this idealism of modernism, but with an ironic and aware component. It brings back some of this grand narrative thinking, but with a bit more humility, a bit more qualified, you know, thinking about that. And I feel like the Hanzi books are that in a nutshell. It's sort of, here's this grand political program that we recognize could be totalitarian, and we also recognize could be, you know, all these different things, but at least we're trying. And so I feel like that's a very quintessentially metamodern gesture in the way that V&V talked about it, but maybe you don't see it that way.
Okay, I have a bunch of different kind of facets.
Sure.
So I guess I'll work backwards from what you just said. So I guess at most I would agree, concede, grant that the Hanzian project could be thought of as a cultural product that is an exemplar of the metamodern sensibility. If, to the extent that that is true, if that is true, nevertheless, you still wouldn't call that metamodernism. You would call it
well, so
something.
so like, let's say Wes Anderson, he's an example I think we'd agree on.
Yeah.
Is, you know, his work is metamodern often,
Yeah.
usually, all that. So right, so it's a metamodern cultural product. I, at the same time, am not looking to Wes Anderson to tell me about cultural theory, you know, either. So I wouldn't necessarily
Right, but
say
you
that it's metamodernism.
you don't call the body of work by Wes Anderson, you don't call that metamodernism. You
True.
call it Wes Anderson's body of work.
Right.
So when you call the body of work by Emil Fries and Daniel Gurtz, aka Hanzi Freinacht, when you call that metamodernism, it's confusing and it narrows it, and it's while their work has metamodern qualities, it also just has a lot of other things that are their particular positions on things, on different topics and issues. And so when you call the lump, the group of all of their proprietary doctrine, and you name that metamodernism, it suggests that other doctrines that I would say are equally valid examples of metamodernism, but very different in what they advocate, you then wouldn't be allowed to call that metamodernism.
Right. So the problem,
they're all metamodern, but
right,
to name, it would be like if Wes Anderson named his films metamodernism, and now I can't say Miranda July's films
Right.
metamodernism.
Right. Well, that's interesting. So that would be something I'd like to pose to them, or folks, in that community would be, do they see this as metamodernism? Are they trying to sort of corner the term and say this is what this is, or is it an instantiation of it, an embodiment, an example? So that's, I think, I would say at least that's an open question. Though I can certainly understand, given the presentation, how it would very much seem to sort of say this is metamodernism when, because
that's not my only problem, though.
Sure. Oh yeah. So continue.
Okay. So then to the question of, okay, so yeah, so if you could say, like, I would kind of like what I was saying, you could say that the fact that they've adopted a somewhat ironic tone and they play some games, they're obviously playing a game with the authorship, which is kind of a postmodern move. And so to the extent they're sort of like applying a postmodern move with the authorship games to a body of content that they do think is important, that's a kind of meta-modern oscillation. So
right, and you call that hyper self-reflexivity in your article, I would say.
Can we get, I mean, that's interesting. I'm not sure. I'm not disagreeing with you, but can we get back to that?
Sure,
I'm not sure if I would or not.
Okay.
But I don't think that the naming of their content as metamodernism is an honest, good faith extension of the conceptual work that Vermeulen and Van Denneker did. If you look at their first, or perhaps it was their second blog post on their Metamodernist site, much of which ended up just becoming the Listening Society book, but not all of it. If you look at the very first or second, I forget which one it is, post, they offer a definition of metamodernism at the time, and this was in like 2015. And their definition of metamodernism at the time, and I might not get it exactly right, but it was very similar to Ken Wilber's project. It was, it was something like metamodernism is a grand unifying theory of all human knowledge at all levels, and in all capacities. And that's Wilber's integral project, is to form a comprehensive system of existence. And that's how they defined their project. And
yeah, I'd have to, because it's interesting. That sounds a lot the way that Brent Cooper talked about metamodernism. And so I want to see if I can,
probably
after all this,
because he came across that article.
Yeah, it could be.
And said, oh, this is cool. I like this. This is the kind of thing I'm into, and I want to get into it,
Okay.
And then a little bit later, their main emphasis kind of in how they define and construe metamodernism was metamodernism is the capacity to master all perspectives. And to me, and you could call that multi-perspectivalism. To me, that is, and I came across other people who would define metamodernism that way, kind of from the sense-making transformationalist sort of world. And to me, that is a kind of misunderstanding of Vermeulen and Van Denneker's observation of this oscillation between modernist and postmodern sensibilities. To actually multi-perspectivalism, a kind of equal interest in varying positions, that's a postmodern thing. And metamodernism is the sensibility that copes with the way that multi-perspectivalism can drain meaning and interiority and conviction and mission. Metamodernism is a way to bring that stuff back in the face of multi-perspectivalism.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah. So for a while they were saying that that was what metamodernism was that it was just multi-perspectivalism, and then it kind of evolved to metamodernism is this stage theory, which is a very Wilberian thing. And so, and really like none of those things, and very rarely, except in that one appendix, do they name or cite Vermeulen
Yeah.
and Van Daneker, or kind of like spend very much serious time kind of considering the importance of that. And furthermore, so like I said at the beginning of this, to me, metamodernism conceptualization starts with looking at the body of artifacts that exist and trying to kind of understand what do they all have in common? What's the sensibility that unites them? When, and everybody just has to take my word for this because I can't pull out quotes and show them, but when I've listened to Daniel Gertz's like various interviews he's done and things like that, when he talks about art, he never says, oh yeah, well, the work on that has already been done by all these other scholars, and I'll tell you what some of the things they found are. It's this, this, and this, and this, and see, that fits in nicely with our theory. I've never heard him say that. He always says, well, there hasn't been very much metamodern art yet. I see that coming down the pike, and we can speculate on what it might look like. And then he names and describes something it's a thing, but it's not the thing.
Sure.
That Vermeulen and Van Daneker. So
Yeah.
to be really blunt, I feel like what they did is they invented a system of thought that has its merits for sure, and kind of randomly named it metamodernism, and then have been dealing with the fallout from that, rather than starting with a actual good faith appreciation of the work and taking it further.
Yeah.
So that's honestly my take.
Okay. So that's just interesting because my experience has just been kind of reading the books, completed, in which case it seems like they've digested the original V&V idea of metamodernism and have been just attempting to take it further. It sounds like you're saying that having been someone witnessing and watching the actual development and their sort of creative process evolve, even pre-publishing their books, that you feel like it was sort of slapdash kind of cobbled together and didn't really begin from a genuine engagement with their ideas, meaning V&V's ideas, but has kind of maybe had to deal, as you say, dealt with the fallout. So I can't speak to that personally, again, just because my experience of it has been very different, because I'm reading their maybe post-fallout, work. And I also, without being able to look at specific blog posts that are dated and seeing how, their evolution of their understanding of the term has shifted, I can't really speak to that. But if what you're saying is true, and I mean, I'm not saying it's not, then that certainly, would be a reason to be wary of just sort of seeing these things as the same thing, or at least I shouldn't even say the same thing, because I don't even think they're the same thing, but just sharing a lineage or a certain continuity. So I think that's a fair point, and it might be worth, I don't know, further exploring that idea and charting that. But at the same time, maybe playing devil's advocate for just a second, I think you could also say that, well, in its final form, it does seem like there's enough engagement with the original ideas that I don't feel like it's, you know, it's calling something that metamodernism that doesn't have metamodern characteristics. I mean, another example would be the adoption of this sort of sincere, ironic stance. And you talked about their authorship under the pseudonym, this being this sort of postmodern move. And I would, again, suggest that it's maybe a great example of metamodern sincere irony at work in terms of creating a figure who is sort of has all the aura of the great philosopher and this kind of Nietzschean Übermensch figure that's sort of this, you know, fun idea, in order to simultaneously mock that idea and own that it's not true, that they're just two guys and blah blah blah, but at the same time to also inhabit that idea of the great philosopher, which is no longer really possible after the postmodern awareness and cynicism and everything. So, and maybe, again, that could be my own imposition of my own work on theirs. At the same time, I feel like they're pretty direct about that in terms of why they do what they do, because I would call my work metamodern, and I feel like that is a tool that I use, the use of self-reflexivity and hyper-awareness and constructedness, not just to deconstruct the idea that, oh, this is a work of art and, you know, what's a work of art, and just do this kind of deconstructive move, but rather to be reconstructive and say, well, what can I do if I put on this persona, if I wear this mask that we all know is a mask, and so we're all aware of it. It's sort of this ironic distancing thing, but at the same time, it then allows you to play out that persona in ways that you get lost in. It's sort of a double framing technique. So I don't know.
I think what you're describing is metamodern. I mean, it's an example of a metamodern move. It's a metamodern move. And to the extent that that's what they're doing with Hanzi, then, you know, that's a metamodern move that they've made. But again, their body of work is not metamodernism. It's Hanziism.
Right.
Right. Also, but also, I'm just going to go out on a limb here. You know, this is just my own little, you know, theory, but for me, you know, kind of make-believe stuff, persona, etc., fakery. So I guess I have this term metamodern fakery. It's the fakery is metamodern if its purpose is to delight the audience, to create a space where the audience can inhabit their sense of possibility and delight and interiority, and the audience is in on it. It's the fakery is not somehow ruined with the audience knowing, like if the audience can just go into it the whole time knowing that it's fake, it still does what it set out to do. And I have examples of that in some of my writing, of stuff that I see people doing in the culture today. And when I look at the Hanzi work, it's like, to the people that are in the know and know that Hanzi is not real, it maybe feels that way, that it's all kind of like a game that they're all participants in, but they don't come out and say, like, their books don't say by Daniel Gertz and Emil Fries. Like, you could read their book naively and never know that Hanzi Freinacht was not real. And I know people who have said, I mean, there's an article written by a integralist woman who was analyzing their work, and she said, and I guess I'm ruining this for her, but she said, I've had conversations with one of the authors of the Hanzi Freinacht work, but he's asked me not to name him. And I've encountered that in other places where like there's kind of this pressure for the people who do know to not let that out to the world. And I didn't know for a while.
I would push back on that a little bit for two reasons. One is, and actually this does get a little bit at my own work. So I put out this book. Well, actually, this whole conversation that we're having at the moment does it really abut a lot of my most recent work. But so I put out this series, the Metamodern Spirituality series, for which I am the author. I'm sorry, the Freudian
editor.
Split. Yeah, the editor. And now the work itself deals specifically. There's an essay called well, one is the midwife, and then there's a postscript to the midwife, and it both texts deal a lot with irony and how irony works or doesn't work and whatnot, and the specific thing that's a focus in the postscript is the issue of irony. When, like, how do you know when someone's being ironic? What are the tells? And this is a really interesting thing, because supposedly in sort of the research or the scholarship on ironic literature, there are a whole bunch of cues that the author is giving that basically any reasonable reader would have to recognize this is not serious, right?
So like, and would one of them just being like taking it a little too far?
Exactly. So exaggeration, incongruity, there are certain kinds of techniques. So Kierkegaard is one who really pioneered this whole thing, 150 years ago. There are ways that, he had a whole pseudonymous writing. And without getting in, because this would be a whole long conversation to kind of get into the whole philosophical implications of all of that. But the role of deceit, or the possibility of deceit, is there, and in the way that you're talking about, and it needs to be grappled with, right? Because if it's a convincing enough ruse, then no one knows that it's a ruse, in which case you're just being deceitful, you're not being ironic. You can't have that playfulness, right? So at the same time, having read the Hanzi books now, I feel like it's pretty clear at multiple points that if you're reading these books, they never come out and say it explicitly, because that would kind of spoil the illusion. And even Kierkegaard recognized that. He's like, as soon as I say this is what I'm doing, I've ruined everything. But you can do enough wink, wink, nudge, nudge that if people still don't get it, it's like, what do you do about that? And so anyway, so I guess my pushback on that would be, yes, it's certainly possible that people can read ironic works and not realize that they're ironic, or that there's a game going on. Then the question becomes, well, what did the author or authors do to give enough cues that hopefully it's not on them, it's on the reader at that point. Of course, postmodern thinking about literature doesn't really provide a lot of tools to be able to get at that, for all sorts of reasons. The death of the author, there is no author, so who has an ulterior meaning and all that. And whereas in metamodern, I think thinking about these things, it kind of becomes a more live option again. But anyway, I guess my main point there is that I feel like it's pretty clear that the Hanzi works are not by a person who is actually out up in the Alps, named Hanzi, in a jacuzzi, and that there's enough explicit considerations of the issues around psychoactive literature and the role of playing with identity and character and persona for the sake of sincere irony, etc., that I feel personally it's a rather masterful implementation of the metamodern idea of sincere irony. And I have some quotes in the editorial introduction to the series that kind of makes that pretty clear, and why it's important. And the the constructive role that ironic distancing can create, rather than just sort of a deconstructive, everything's silly and constructed and all that. So anyway, so that would be my perspective on that. But and I would also say too that, just personally speaking, as I talked briefly with one of the authors about, because I am going to make a video on kind of this sort of political metamodernism.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically said, well, how do you want to be talked about? Is this a thing that, like, and they were basically like, well, we want to keep up the persona. We want to keep up the idea. So he's like, do what you want, but it's our preference that you would keep that going. And as an author, I can also, I find I'm sympathetic to that. And so, yeah, I don't feel like it's this attempt to defraud or to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. I feel like it's an earnest attempt to create a certain kind of persona that's larger than life, because it is fun, as you say, it is engaging, and it has a dynamic quality that it's a magic, that gets lost if then you. So that would be my take on the whole pseudonymous writing element of their work. But those are just some first thoughts. I haven't really done too much on that.
No, I mean, I'm sympathetic to a lot of what you're saying. I just I have a few different angles. I guess I oscillate in my reaction to it, which maybe indicates that, it's an example of metamodernism in that way, that it engenders that.
Yeah. Well,
sure.
So we're around the hour mark. I would, I don't know how much time you have, but I would say, what was I going to say? I was going to say a couple things. One is, at this point, I feel like one of the interesting, I think, things that I've gotten from our conversation so far anyway, is that I think we can kind of agree, I'm willing to say, that it's a bit too much to allow the Hanzi books to be metamodernism.
Mm-hmm.
However, there seems to be this sort of open question: are they metamodern? Are they an example of the metamodern sensibility as V&V put forth?
Yeah.
And it seems like that's maybe something. So what do you think would be sort of the most constructive, way to find some kind of, I don't know, reconciliation is too strong of a term, because I feel like there isn't really an actual, open conflict or anything. It's just, yeah. But at the same time, I personally feel like these are different things that are going on that I feel like are all certainly related. You might say more nominally than actually content-wise, but I think that there's a genuine attempt to move beyond the impasses and the cul-de-sacs of postmodernism to engage the world in ways that are constructive, reconstructive, and to attempt to understand the world and where we are now, as opposed to where we were 25 years ago, which was a very different time and a very different sensibility. And that whether it's the metamodernism of Hanzi, or it's the more academic cultural theory metamodernism of V&V, or even whether it's the integral folks in these different kinds of communities, is there a way to not maybe allow the genuine divisions or divergences that might exist to kind of interrupt what genuine constructive or reconstructive work everyone might be trying to be doing, if that makes sense? So that'd be my question. And if so, what does that look like for you? Or are there certain, what's the expression, crosses to die on? I forget.
Hill to die on.
Hill to die. Is there a certain, you're like, no, this is really important that we make these distinctions, and
Yeah. Well, I mean, on one hand, like, I feel like I don't want I don't want like Greg Dember's claim to fame to be the guy that saved the word metamodernism from Hanzi
Mm,
Freinacht or whatever. I don't want
mm,
to be like the guy that, I don't even want to be known as that guy who has some really fine distinctions about how the term should be used or whatever. Like I want to be the guy who gives people insight into some, scintillating films and music, and even I'm actually working on an essay on an ethics of a
mm.
personal ethics that I think is metamodern. I want to be known for content, not
Yeah,
for meta. Um, so on the one hand, like I don't want to remain preoccupied with this. Um, I guess I think that what everybody can do is focus on the content. So um, for the Hanzi authors to focus on their actual ideas about, making the world a better place. And they may end up naming that metamodernism. I don't have control over that. And for me to focus on, my observations and interpretations of existing cultural products, and then I myself am a musician, songwriter, and to, make stuff that may be metamodern
yeah.
by
Well,
my understanding.
let me ask it this way. I mean, uh, do you think that do you think, say, the work that the Hanzi books are doing is net positive, or because of how you feel it confuses the term metamodernism, it's a kind of net negative?
Um, I don't think it's crucial to the world that the word metamodernism gets defined the way I want to get it defined, So like um so I think it's good that they're out there inspiring people to think about new ways of doing society and such. I mean, I think what they're doing is taking Ken Wilber's work and putting a spin on it that brings it to a new audience. Um, but I also I don't see that, I don't see Wilbur's work or the content of the Hanzi work as being Earth's salvation. Like I don't, and I'm not putting it down. I'm just like, it has no special place for me
Hmm.
in in the work of saving the world. It's like a thing of
Yeah.
the of many, many, many projects that different people are
It sounds
doing.
like, so you have read the books or parts of the books, or
I've read all of, I own the Nordic ideology,
mhm.
and I've read all of the blog posts on Metamoderna, and it has been told to me that if you've done that, you've mostly read Listening Society, but I'm taking that on faith, and I understand that I may have missed some
Okay.
some
Well,
stuff.
that's good to know. Yeah, because it would be interesting if you it, to maybe revisit some of this if you do wind up reading the Listening Society, and if that gives you a different
Yeah, I
spin
might
on.
reading
Yeah,
it from cover to cover in the way they've arranged
yeah.
it with additional content that I haven't seen might. Yeah, I think you're just making me own up to the fact that I don't necessarily know all of what they're doing, and
Well, I mean, I asked because actually I was rather, to be perfectly honest, a bit averse to the Hanzi stuff
okay,
before I actually delved into it. I kind of thought, here's this thing that's sort of like, how is this metamodernism,
oh,
and
okay,
and also, yeah, I couldn't quite place it or kind of see what was so, what its thing was, and it seemed to be yeah, using this term in a way that I felt like, well, but that's not quite right. And then I just read the Listening Society, and I was like, and the first, I mean, where it really started to kind of clicking was in the discussion of developmental stages. So, because actually, I guess maybe the best way of putting it is my initial conception of it was that here's a kind of leftist political program that is sort of wrapping itself in the nomenclature of metamodernism.
Okay.
And that was sort of how I interpreted it. And then since reading it, I've sort of realized, well, no, it is a lot more than that. There is this sort of stage element to it, this kind of Wilberian element of personal development, but there's a much bigger vision. Also, in reading it, I got the sense of just how much the authors are genuinely well versed in their subject matter in terms of there's a clear, very genuine, authentic digestion of postmodernism, postmodern writers, Foucault, and all this stuff, and a rather wide field of literature that it's not. I had originally kind of a conception that maybe this is just kind of superficial, but actually, after reading, I'm like, wow, these are very capable and really rather brilliant fellows that are doing a really bold project, and they're doing it within the kind of or claiming to be doing it within this metamodern framework. So that was something that definitely changed for me after reading the books. And since then, I am much more willing to kind of be a broad tent metamodernist, I guess I'll say. It also, what was, I think, kind of the real fun thing for me was that I've also been doing this sort of pseudonymous authorship, highly inspired by Kierkegaard, but also in ways that I felt to be very much in a metamodern way, in the sort of hyper self-reflexivity way that you referred to. I'd already been kind of doing a project like that. And then when I recognized, well, here's a whole community of people who have sort of gathered around this term metamodernism, which, I have been also deeply interested in for, many years now, who get this idea, it sort of seemed like a very natural marriage of like, okay, this is a community who gets these sorts of things. And increasingly, I do want to, I want to avoid the perfect being the enemy of the good when it comes to pretty much anything, whether that's putting work out into the world or finding the ideal community for your work or whatever. I've often shot myself in the foot that way, trying to sort of, make the work as perfect in my own conception of it, even if like no one reads it. And of course, then it's like, well, what good is that? Long story short, there were just a lot of things about this that seemed like, here's a really interesting, configuration of ideas that seems to have some legs to it, has some momentum to it, and has an an audience that is really genuinely interested in bettering the world. And I think that the last time I felt as excited about a particular kind of community of people doing things was when the IDW kind of first showed up. And it was like, wow, people are actually interested in long form intellectual conversations. Unfortunately, a lot of that was sort of a cover for this kind of, darker, not all of it certainly, but there was certainly, if you get on some Jordan Peterson fan pages on Facebook, you're going to go down a rabbit hole of racism and sexism. It's awful. And so, but
you walk into the ID, if you're coming from the left-ish like me and maybe you, but you also believe in discourse and listening to the other side and not, you walk into the IDW thinking like, oh, this is going to be a bunch of people who are committed to listening to each other and talking and not presuming things. But what I ended up finding, and it sounds like you did, is it's mostly right-wing people who are leveraging critiques against the left in the name of free speech. And unfortunately.
And I mean, that's, again, I mean, that could be a whole other tangent we could go down. But yeah, I was disappointed by what I found. Again, not even necessarily so much about the kind of figureheads themselves per se, but just kind of the community around them. And conversely, I feel like the community that's sort of engaging in this metamodernist, even the integral thing that's happening, I find to be very constructive, and so I could try to kind of, parse, like, well, that's not quite my understanding of how metamodernism is, or like how do we do this, or how do we mix this in with what they're saying, him and but then ultimately, again, in the sense of trying to avoid the perfect being the enemy of good, it's like, well, here are some people that are, I think, in some ways very genuinely embodying that metamodern spirit of recognizing that the world is incredibly complex, incredibly broken, and but also not just becoming apathetic to that, but also trying to genuinely and earnestly make positive change, even while recognizing that that is fraught and that it is, maybe even futile, but doing it nonetheless. And again, all that is those are positive characteristics. So those are all factors in my embrace of this sort of bigger tent metamodernism, for whatever that's worth. But
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think my metaphor for it is we're all on a beach, and the beach is terminology and language and concepts, and two groups of people have showed up and set up bonfires kind of close to each other, where, according to the people who run the beach, there's only supposed to be one bonfire there. And we each have our own boom box, and we're, playing our music. And in each of those groups, some of the people are like, well, that's cool. Like, those people seem kind of interesting. Why do we have, well, let's just make one big bonfire. And then some of the other people were like, well, I was kind of planning to like reconnect with some of my old friends, or whatever the purpose, or we were going to plan our camping trip, or whatever the reason was, and can't we just do that? And but yet we're all on this beach and we have to share it, because
I love that. That is right. I think that is both realist and also within that metaphor. I think that, yes, it's like I think you can find different solutions to that situation in terms of how different people might react to that sort of situation. It's actually an interesting one for me too, because knowing the kind of person that I am, I would probably be more like who are these guys? Like, I brought my Bach, and they're playing, Cyndi Lauper. I don't know. This doesn't mesh, but at least, in this particular context that we're talking about, I'm trying to explore ways of bringing these things together, while also, admitting and accepting and realizing that, yes, there will be genuine differences in ways in which that isn't going to work or shouldn't work. But anyway, I don't know, this has been a really interesting conversation and fruitful, I think. And again, there's so much on all these topics we could keep going at some length, I'm sure, but I would suggest that we pick it up at some other time and maybe explore a different avenue of metamodernism.
I think, as I mentioned, Linda and I, we have our own little video conversation series, and it might be a good idea to have you on and focus more specifically on your own work.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love that. I just, as launched this book series, and so I'd love to be asked the questions instead of asking the questions, and get into all that. So that would definitely be fun. Are there also any other sites or plugs you wanna make for any of the work that you're doing? Or
I think you mentioned the 11 methods in the metamodern arts article, and then I would just mainly want to plug our home website, and then if you're putting like show notes or something like that. So we have our webs, but if anyone's listening, we have this website, ismetamodern.com, and that's the hub for all the different things that Linda and I do together. And one of the things is this YouTube channel, so there's that as well.
Great. Yeah, I will. When I mash all this together, I'll make some links and everything, and this will probably all be in there anyway. Well, cool. Well, Greg, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. If there are additional thoughts jot them down, and we'll pick them up at a later date. But this has been fantastic. So thank you so much, and we'll pick this up at another time, as I say. And thank you for watching.